Hey folks, welcome back. In this video, we'll look at setting up your workspace for coloring, and we'll actually do a hands-on demo where we color this Coyote image from start to finish. And then you'll understand some of the basic keyboard shortcuts and some workflow tricks that will help you as you watch some of the later videos. So let's get started. The first thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we go to Window and that we can see our color panel. If that's not visible, make sure that it's visible. Mine is visible and it has a check mark next to it. And I just toggled it off. Let me toggle it back on. And you might see something that looks like this. Now, I prefer the color panel to the swatches panel because it gives me much more nuance in terms of the types of colors that I can choose. It's not discrete. Like if you look at your swatches panel, you can see discrete colors, much like Crayola crayons. But in the color panel, you have not only the color itself, but you also have a whole slew of grayscale values that you can choose from. Now, the color panel is kind of interesting, and I'm just going to pull this panel out so I can speak about it a little bit more. I prefer to actually go to the hamburger menu, and I like to look at the color wheel. And this is really nice because what it allows me to do is it allows me to look at my primary colors, my red, my green, my blue, as well as my secondary colors. And it allows me to make my choices, and I can move across the entire spectrum very, very easily. And you can see that I've got corresponding hue, saturation, and brightness controls that are also available. And this currently tells me what my color is. I've got a green color currently selected. If I move this over, I have red. And that is also reflected in the toolbar on the far left-hand side. This is what is known as my foreground color. And the white color that's in the back, if I click on it, that is the corresponding background color. Okay? So typically we work with the foreground color, but in case you have two colors that you're alternating between, it's a good idea to prime the background color accordingly. Now, that being said, what if I want to get back to my defaults really quick? If I hit my X and D key, the D actually turns the colors back to their default black foreground, white background. X basically switches your foreground and background color. So that's a really important keyboard shortcut to notice. Notice that up here in the color panel, when I hit the X key, it flip-flops the background and foreground color. So this makes it much easier to switch if you need to. So that being said, I like to use this color wheel, and I like to keep it off to the side. I make some use of the color wheel, but I don't utilize it fully, and I'll explain what I mean by that as I go ahead and do my coloring demo. So when you're coloring, you never want to color on the same layer as your inks. For that reason, what I prefer to do is I like to lock the inks layer so that I don't accidentally color on top of it. Now, as you're working, you may have to unlock your inks layer because maybe there's a certain gap or some other tweak that you need to make to the actual line art, and that's fine. Just remember to go ahead and lock it when you're done. And take it from me, I forget quite a bit, and it happens to all of us. So if it happens to you, no big deal. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to make a brand new layer. This is going to be the layer that we're going to be coloring on. We always want to color on a layer that is underneath our inks. This allows our inks to show through nice and crisp. If we color on the same layer as we ink, it first of all, it limits what we can do, because if we had to isolate the line art for whatever reason, it's going to be much more cumbersome and difficult. But second of all, it just erodes into your inks. And I just generally recommend having colors on the layer underneath your inks layer. All right, now in this part of the process, your selection tools are going to be really important. My strategy for coloring something like this would be to select the character. Now, how do I select the character? Because there's all sorts of little doodads. I could use the magic wand tool, which is located on the toolbar. If you don't already see it, you might see quick selection, but just make sure that you click and hold down on that menu item to choose magic wand tool. And while you're at it, you can make sure that you also have anti-alias, contiguous, and sample all layers. These three need to be checked. So some people might say, well, I'll just use the magic wand tool. I'll click on this part. I'll hold the shift key down. I'll click on this part, and then I'll keep going and selecting the whole character to go ahead and color. And you can certainly do that. And that's what I used to do. But then I discovered an amazing trick that really makes things a lot simpler. So let me hit Command D to deselect and show you what I'm talking about. If I were to use the magic wand tool, and I have these settings already established, if I click outside of my Coyote, it selects the area that is outside of the character. And all I need to do at this point is go ahead and hold down the Shift Command I key, and that inverses the color selection. And what I like about this is it actually, if we zoom in, we can see that the selection is directly at the edge of all of my line art. And that's a really important thing because you want your colors to run right up to the edge of your ink so you don't see any weird white pixels showing up. So I've made my selection of the Coyote, and then my next strategy is, okay, well, what color is this Coyote? Well, in the cartoons, it's brown. So let me go ahead and flip my foreground color. And I will choose kind of a brownish color like so. And on the layer underneath my inks, I will flood that color in. The way I do that is by holding down the Option Delete key or Alt Backspace on my Windows using machines. And this way it fills all of the color in. And that is useful for several reasons. If I want to select the entire character, as a silhouette, for example, I now have that available for me. The other important consideration is it allows me to then make selections on the character and extract parts of the character so that they will be on their own separate layers. Let me demonstrate what I'm talking about. So here's my strategy. Here's what I do. Let me deselect what I currently have. And the way I color is I establish a base color. I'll just go ahead and call this base. And then with the magic wand tool on the base layer, I will select, say, his muzzle and his nose. That's usually all one color. It's usually a lighter color if you look at the reference images for the Coyote. With that selection, I will hit Command J. That jumps a selection onto its own layer. So what it's done is it's literally taken out this piece and put it on its own layer. Command J for jump. That's the way I remember it. Once you've jumped this selection onto its own layer, I can now hit Command U to bring up the hue saturation panel, and I can go ahead and dial in a few values. I can say, well, I need this to be lighter. I also want to change the hue. Let me pump up the saturation a little bit. And I can get the colors dialed in with very little fuss. And I can click OK. Now, I could have gone back to my color wheel, and I can keep picking from my color wheel, but I find that working with the hue saturation panel generally gets me the colors that I want in a much quicker fashion. So what I want to do next is I want to repeat the process. Let's now color his eye, the whites or the yellows of his eyes. I'll go back to the base layer. I'll use my magic wand tool and click in that particular area. I'll hold down my shift key to add to my selection. When I hold down the shift key, notice that there's a small plus next to the magic wand tool. That means it is going to add to that selection. So now I've got both eyes selected. Now I can hit Command J to jump that selection onto its own layer. Command U. Let me adjust the hue. And there we go. He's got those bright yellow eyes. And let's repeat that process again. Let's look at the areas that are white, the white of his eyes. So again, holding down the shift key with my magic wand tool, I'm selecting all the areas that are white. Command J, Command U. And to get white, the easiest way to do that is to adjust the lightness all the way to the right. If you adjust the lightness all the way to the left, it turns black. So this is how I can get those super light and super dark values. I'll click OK. Let's go back to the base layer. Let's select the inner part of his ear. Command J, Command U, and we'll make that kind of pink. And we'll make it lighter. And we'll go back to the base layer. Let's make this ear darker. And you can see here, if I zoom in on this ear, I didn't get the entire ear. No problem. I can always use my Shift key with the Magic Wand tool to add to my selection. Command J, Command U, and we're making that darker. Why? Well, because that ear is further away from us. So this gives a little bit more depth by changing the colors. Now, these are all color flats. I've not added any highlights or any shading. They're all uniformly one mid value, right? So I've got this character now colored. So that's just basically an introduction to digital coloring and the workflow that I'm going to share with you as we get into more complex examples. So download the starter file if you haven't already done so. Follow along with what I'm doing here. Acclimate yourself to some of these keyboard shortcuts and make sure that your settings are correct before we get into something more complex. I'll see you in the next video.